My name is Christina Moore, and this is the presentation of my final paper for Professor Fazzino's course, Anthropology 242, Native Cultures of Alaska. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss the prominent shortcomings with Alaska Native education. I will provide a historical background of the educational institutions as they relate to Alaska Native students, and I will briefly mention the current statistics for Indigenous Native students in America. I will explain what is traditionally required in classrooms for Alaska Native students to succeed educationally, and I will discuss how this conflicts with the current Western educational methods that are used in schools. I will also describe the importance of traditional language use and retention for Alaska Native students and the intersection between Native culture and community with the educating of Alaska Native students. I will conclude with some culturally appropriate suggestions for educators involved in the teaching of Alaska Native students. Prior to Alaska's statehood, Russian explorers, fur traders, and missionaries occupied the state from the early 1700s. The Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian American Company provided schooling for Alaska Native children. During this time, literacy excelled, and the Aleutians in particular became extremely competent readers and writers of both Russian and Aleut languages. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from the Russians. At this point in time, the government already possessed educational policies and programs that had been created for the indigenous Native Americans residing in the contiguous states. Thus, the government used these policies with Alaska Native education. In the beginning, tribal leaders accepted governmental impingement because they believed that there would be a convergence of European and Indian knowledge. However, the U.S. government created an educational environment that ignored Native education efforts and eliminated their cultural uniqueness. For a time, tribal leaders had no choice but to ignore this interference in order to ensure the survival of their tribes. The first piece of legislation to be passed after the purchase of Alaska was the Organic Act of 1884. This act delegated the responsibility of educating Alaska Natives to the Office of the United States Secretary of the Interior, then later to the Bureau of Education. The government's first steps under this act were to create day schools and state boarding schools in Alaska Native villages where a strict English-only policy governed all language and curriculum decisions. This led to the creation of a dual system of education which began in the early 1900s with the migration of non-natives who relocated to Alaska for industrial purposes. Within this dual system, students attended school based on race, and Alaska Native students were segregated from non-Native students. There were schools where only white children and children of mixed blood were permitted to attend, so long as they lived a civilized life. The Bureau of Education gradually increased the services they provided to Alaska Natives to include general social welfare, medical care, and cooperative stores. However, the Bureau operated under the belief that the best recourse for the education of Alaska Native students was to transform them into civilized and Christian Americans through assimilation. They did not recognize the unique differences between Native and non-Native students, and the Native population quickly began to lose their autonomy. It wasn't until 1928, when the Merriam Report was issued, that the government surveyed the educational conditions amongst the Indians. The report called for a major reformation of American Indian education with Indian involvement at all levels of the educational process, and with specific recommendations that education be tied to communities, day schools extended, boarding schools reformed, Indian language and culture included in the development of the curriculum, and field services decentralized. The report ushered in the introduction of new legislation. The Alaska Reorganization Act allowed Alaska Natives to form village governments, which allowed them a greater degree of autonomy and sovereignty. The Johnson-O'Malley Act was the first step in abolishing the dual educational system. The act provided funds to government schools for the education of Alaska Native children, asserting their legal responsibility of educating Indians. This act also initiated the transferring of federal BIA-run schools to the territory of Alaska. The transfers were successful up until Alaska began its bid for statehood in the 1950s. At that point, public support for the educational reform was halted in light of the political situation. Thus, when Alaska reached statehood in 1959, the dual system of education was unfortunately still present in Alaska. The advocacy for equality in Indigenous education found new stride in the mid-1960s and early 1970s when the civil rights and women's movements were implemented. The Alaska Native people chose this atmosphere to advocate for themselves and formed activist groups. That period of time became known as the Great Society and saw the introduction of several federal programs geared towards educational equality. Examples of those included Head Start and the Community Action Programs, both of which Alaska Natives participated in. Several U.S. presidents voiced their verbal support of giving back local control to the Indians. Referring back to the Merriam Report of 1928, several commissions and task forces were formed in support of the reform. At the persistence of Indian educators within the BIA, several federal education programs were initiated. Unprecedented reforms in local control options and support for incorporation of Alaska Native language and culture in schools likely would not have received the same level of support in Alaska had the window of opportunity not previously opened at the national level. The state became involved in the educational reform in Alaska and contributed $133 million for the creation of Village, Alaska high schools, thus abolishing the need for boarding schools. Today, nearly all Alaska students attend elementary and secondary school in either a village school, rural regional center, and/or road system or marine highway school, or an urban school in the larger populated areas. In 2002, the National Education Association released a report about the status of education amongst American Indian and Alaska Native students. Approximately 1%, which is equivalent to about 550,000 of the nation's public, elementary, and secondary school students, were American Indian and Alaska Native. In the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, 7% of the students were Native. In Alaska, 26% of the student population is Native, and 38% attend rural public schools, and 31% of Alaska Native students attend schools where they consist of at least 50% of the student population. In 2003, 15% of Native students aged 16 to 24 years old had not finished high school or completed a GED. This rate was twice as high as the rate for white students, 4 times as high as the rate for Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and about the same as black students. Natives also possess the second highest school dropout rate, following only behind that of black students. Native American students also score lower than any other minority group in basic reading, math, and history comprehension. These statistics show that Native students possess a lower rate of persistence to graduate, and it is believed that a contributing factor to this is a lack of alignment between students' home culture and public schools' teaching methods. In an article from 2005, authors Barnhart and Kawagli go further with the concept when they discussed how Indigenous students demonstrate a general lack of enthusiasm with Western schooling methods, which is understandable given that Native students learn with hands-on approaches and collaboratively, neither methods being part of Western curricula. The authors believe that Native people may need to understand Western society, but not at the expense of what they already know and the way they have come to know it. Fortunately, many educators have recognized that a monocultural educational system is not beneficial for all students, and especially severely limits Alaska Native students. In the article, the authors present a theory of combining the two knowledge systems, Indigenous and Western, into an education system that will integrate the core values of each society and produce student success. To combine the two systems, they each must be understood individually. The hallmark of Western science and education is to decontextualize knowledge in order to teach it in the detached setting of a classroom or laboratory. This contrasts with Indigenous acquisition of knowledge, in which they learn about their natural world through direct experience and through the context of survival. Western education also measures competency through the use of objective tests, whereas the Indigenous measure competency through the direct use of the skill, and again, as it relates to survival. The Indigenous view science in the way it relates to the world around them and how it applies to their subsistence activities, and again, their survival. They also analyze natural systems and the way they relate to each other, seeing everything in nature as connected, rather than compartmentalizing as Western science does. The Alaska Rural Systemic Initiative is an example of an effort that has begun to address the issues that are associated with the integration of two knowledge systems, Western and Indigenous. The initiative consists of 20 school districts that were formed to serve 20,000 predominantly Native students. The activities associated with the initiative have been aimed at fostering connectivity and complementarity between the Indigenous knowledge systems rooted in the Native cultures that inhabit rural Alaska and the formal education systems imported to serve the educational needs of rural Native communities. This has been done through the implementation of cultural atlas development, parent and community involvement, science camps and fairs, cultural resources and websites, creating standards for culturally responsive schools, and leadership development. The initiative has proven to strengthen the quality of schooling for Alaska Natives and has improved their academic performance. Educators will inevitably possess their own perspective on the style and content of the curriculum that should be used. However, educators must recognize that a culturally responsive science curriculum will have positive effects on all students. In an article from 1999, authors Hens and Davis approached the significance of language retention and emphasized that the losing of one's native language is equivalent to the losing of a core element of one's cultural heritage. However, they urged that the speakers themselves, the natives to whom the language belongs, hold the responsibility for the survival or extinction of their language and should ultimately be the ones to advocate for its preserving. However, educators and communities can assist with the retention of language by using it in school programs, community-based programs, consciousness raising, and child socialization practices in the home, informal apprenticeships, etc. The government has made strides towards recognizing and encouraging the use and retention of traditional languages in schools. For example, in 1990, the Native American Languages Act was formed, and its purpose was to preserve, protect, and promote the right to use and practice Native American languages. Prior to this law, public policy had suppressed the use of native language. Language has proven to be a central element of the Alaska Native way of life. In 1991, an author named Jerry Lipka with the University of Fairbanks conducted a case study of one Yupik Eskimo teacher in an effort to show that the only effective way to teach Alaska Native students is with an Alaska Native teacher. While his idea is impractical for the educational system within Alaska, given the shortage of Alaska Native teachers, he does present thorough evidence of how successful a curriculum can be when it is taught in a culturally sensitive manner. For instance, he claims that when Yupik teachers are teaching Yupik children and relating to culturally compatible ways in village settings, many of the so-called factors of minority school failure may be dismissed. His case study videotapes an Alaska Native classroom during their instruction by an Alaska Native teacher. He points out the nuances that are often conducted without thought because of the absence of cultural divide. He shows readers a seamless educational process where students are allowed to learn at their own pace and with their own traditional language, with occasional English being used. The point the author is making through the case study is that culturally appropriate classrooms are conducive to fostering a desire to learn amongst the Alaska Native students. A crucial element for ensuring Alaska Native student success is the adequate preparation of educators. Educators can become prepared to teach Alaska Native students through exposure to their culture. Educators must be able to understand how students interact with their home environment, which includes their traditions, beliefs, ways of living, everyday routines, and the place they have within their family and community. Non-Native educators can be taught the importance of cultural integration and can find success in indigenizing the curriculum so that the Native students have hands-on learning that is so important to their educational development. Educators must be willing to learn about the history and culture of the Native students in their classroom, which involves community immersion. Community immersion takes effort and persistence, but pays off when the community members and tribal elders recognize this effort and show appreciation through increased involvement in the student's success in school. A key tool for involving the community in the student's education is requesting that Native community members step forward to work with educators to prepare materials, teach classes, share knowledge and skills, and find other creative ways to inform the education of their children. With ambitious educators, willing and cooperative community members, and the student's natural propensity to absorb knowledge, teaching within an Indigenous classroom can be successful and prepare Indigenous students for success in the world after school.